So next up, we have Dr. Sally Guzman, Family and Community Engagement Coordinator at the Edmonds School District, to speak about history and contributions of Latino in Washington State. Dr. Sally Guzman is the Family and Community Engagement Coordinator for the Edmonds School District, where she has worked since 2014. She has worked in direct services to families for over 18 years and has an array of experience. Her passion is working in education and fighting for equity and leading to create anti-racist systems. Dr. Guzman is a bilingual, bicultural, first-generation Indigenous Latina born in Peru and immigrated to Linwood, Washington with her family when she was 5 years old. Please help me welcome Dr. Sally Guzman.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. Gracias, Leah. That was a really cute bio. I've lived in Linwood most of my life or in the area, so I really appreciate being able to do this, and I'm going to try to do justice to Dr. Antonio Sanchez's presentations, but I have made some modifications. So for those of you who have seen his before, yes, mine is different. Let me see here. I'm going to share my screen for you all. Can you see everything? Okay. And if at all possible, if you could turn on your camera, that helps me as a presenter make sure that people are following along, that I'm making sense, that people aren't falling asleep. And it's something that I've learned as a presenter now for many years on Zoom to ask for what I need to ensure that I'm providing you a really good presentation, because the last thing I want to do is bore everyone. I borrowed some excerpts from Dr. Sanchez. So the first question he had on his slide, I really liked it. So, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation because I didn't practice enough. Who is Taloxlico? I'm pretty sure I'm saying that wrong. And for those of you, I'll give you a geographical clue. It is from what we now call Mexico. So does anyone know who they are? If you do, okay. So he, like learning, right? So he places this photo first because oftentimes as Latinos, as Hispanic, as Chicanx, however we wish to identify, we don't know our own cultural context, whether it's not our native areas from which we come from historically, like our families or ourselves, or we don't know our own contributions to the United States. So there's actually a statue of him in now I'm going to butcher another thing, Tlaxcala, Mexico. So this is not like the photo that he has is a photo of the statue. And that's something that people go and see because that is how, like if you were in Mexico and you were learning about history, instead of learning about, Lewis and Clark, you might learn about this person, right? So one of the things that I really like to talk about is that, as we improve our understanding of historically what happened, it's been really amazing. So like one of the things that I really have been loving is that they have found artifacts that prove that Indigenous communities have been here before this supposed land bridge. And we literally have been here in these areas since time immemorial. So while we might have a more documented history after colonization, that doesn't mean we don't have history prior to that. And with archaeological digs today, we actually have plenty of proof to show that North and South America were trading with one another, right? Because if you think about it, potatoes are originated from Peru, which is where I'm from, but you find that in cuisine all the way around the Americas. So it's not like we only talked to each other, right? There's a lot of trade going on. And that's important to note because oftentimes history classes in the US painted as that the only people who were explorers, the only people who traded and brought in commerce were the Europeans who came over and violently colonized our area, right? So let us not forget that because our current nationalities They're amazing. I'm a very proud Peruvian. They are a social construct. And that social construct can be really limiting to us if we see it that way. And it's important to note that prior to colonization, there were no these lines did not exist. There might have been territories, there might have been space in which a community lived. So currently, I'm on the land of the Coast Salish Nations, and my closest tribe is the Tulalip tribes, which is actually I learned recently it's a combination of multiple tribes in the area. It wasn't a tribe prior to the Point Elliott Treaty. And their territories, they ran all what we call the Strait of Juan de Fuca and the Puget Sound, they call it the Coast Salish Sea. And so that goes into what we now call Canada. But again, these borders did not exist. They were brought on by colonization. So this is a map that I like to show. This is what territories look like after colonization, but before the American-Mexican War. And so you'll see here this yellow area. This is showing you what was considered the Republic of Mexico. And I don't think a lot of people realize that that included all of California, all the way to which one's that river? Hmm. I don't know what river that is right now, but what would it be? Colorado, maybe? Does that feel right? And all that was considered Mexico, which means that it was colonized by Spain. And so the language spoken there the most was Spanish. And we can see that historically. I don't know how many of you have gone through California and even parts of our area where things are labeled like San Diego, Los Angeles. These are all names given by Spanish colonizations who actively, you know, mixed, to put it politely, with indigenous communities in these areas. So when we think about our history, for better or for worse, we do have to kind of like acknowledge that most of us have both indigenous and colonized roots. And therefore, too, that means that our ancestors were also like these people creating these spaces. Um, and if you notice, like if you think about it, California, that bottom part of California to us in Seattle or even like the border of Washington and Oregon, is only like maybe 6 hours. And so to think that there wasn't people of our same background in Washington state prior to the creation of agriculture and migrant workers is very close-minded. And it leads society to believe that it's okay to other us. And let me make sure, where am I? Oh, that didn't like me. Okay. And so one of the things that I really try to think about in these situations are like, what have been the tools to perpetuate white supremacy in the United States? What do I need to acknowledge as a human? So first, it comes from understanding your history, understanding your roots and who you are, how you view the world. That's very important when you're working with other people because you never know how those are coming up and how you're pushing those ideals on others. It's good to know what you bring to the table, right? And then second of all, in understanding that we've lived under colonial rule for quite a while. So as a Latino, it's really important for us to understand that while we cannot perpetuate racism as a person of color, we can perpetuate things like colorism or immigration, right? Like, well, I was born here, I'm third or fourth generation, and making someone who recently immigrated here feel less wanting to be in these lands. And a common thing that the US does in order to justify its behavior as a society, whether it was colonization, the genocide of indigenous communities, the slavery of humans, um, or the maltreatment of every other cultural group who was different than them. It was to dehumanize them. So when things are occurring like COVID or 9/11, are we perpetuating that othering on full on communities, right? Versus focusing on those who contributed to the actual physical harm or what is actually occurring. That's really important because it's really easy to be like, oh, well, if those people hadn't have, et cetera, right? But you're generalizing, and that generalization of someone being less than you because of a difference is quite literally a cultural norm in America that allows for them to feel appropriate to do much more harm. Colorism, right? Like I was young and I heard it once, like you have to marry someone lighter than you to mejorar la raza, which translates to better the race. And I was so offended and confused because it wasn't something I'd heard as a child in my family. But then as I got older and I finally got to work with other Latinos, because for a large part of living in Linwood, for a large part of my career, my schooling, I was with a lot of white people. I learned that it was actually more common in their communities, and it's really important we have these discussions with our families to understand that while you might not be actively maybe like saying, oh, you're lighter than me or darker than me, you might unwillingly be doing some unconscious biases. Trying to think what else. Okay. So the other thing that the US has done since colonization is to take away our history and our language, right? We're talking the 1970s, a teacher could hit you if you spoke Spanish. And in some states, corporal punishment of students is still allowed. It's just highly frowned upon and you shouldn't do it, right? But I'm an educator in Washington State, and every year I have to do a training called Safe Schools. And it's super interesting to me that they have to be like, well, Washington State allows corporal punishment of students. We advise you to absolutely not do this. And it's interesting because if you think about it, right, like it's 2024 and our state law still says corporal punishment is allowable because it hasn't been that long since it was around. We were taken out of history books, right? Like, I don't know how many of you heard of the New Mexico battle where literally the state wanted to come in and say, you can't teach ethnic studies. We're going to make it illegal for you to teach ethnic studies. We have the honor of working with the Cheeto Project and here in Washington and learning about some of their tools that they were using. But that is historically what they try to do is you try to assimilate to the main cultural norms. And through that assimilation, we lose not just some of ourselves, but some of our cultural norms and values. Along with that is a demonization of, sorry, my English words are skipping. Individualism. Oh, it's the opposite of individualism and it's on the tip of my tongue. The word went away in English and in Spanish.
Collectivism.
Huh?
Collectivism.
Thank you, gracias, Susie. Collectivism, right? So there's this myth when I was in high school, all white school. Like maybe there were some Latino people there, but nobody was owning it like Sally. I was definitely the weird kid. And I had people telling me the weirdest things based on what you could find. And technically, I don't think it's changed too much, but like in the 90s and in the 2000s, there was a lot of TV that perpetuated that Latinos were gang members, that Latinos were uneducated, and that Latinos didn't care that their daughters got educated. That was like a huge like belief in education. And so my mother was a teacher in my country. And my family partially came here because they realized that Sally's inability to follow social norms was not going to go over well long term. And so, like, I would have teachers when I was not doing well in school because I wasn't engaged in their teaching. That it shouldn't matter to me that my family doesn't want me to be successful. That I should consider myself and pull myself up basically by my bootstraps. And that was like to me, I was raised to be respectful to elders. In my head, I'm like, oh my gosh, you're so stupid. But like to them, I'm just smiling and nodding because like, what am I gonna say to this elder? Cállate la boca, like shut up. No, you don't do that. And when I just pushed it out of my head. I was like, you people are stupid. And then when I went into education, which was a really hard decision to go into the education system as an employee, I was horrified to find that some of those stereotypes that were around when I was in school were still being held. I still had teachers asking me, like, why would I call the family? Like, do they even care? And I was like, unless you call the family and they pick up the phone and say, I don't care, you're making a negative assumption about somebody off of some biasy that you're holding. So, yes, you do need to call the family. I can call with you. We can do this together. Um, but no, you don't get to assume that because they're Latino or because they speak another language, that they don't want to be as involved in their student education as their white counterparts. So so along with all these stereotypes was this idea that collectivism was detrimental to building independence and being successful. And this idea that because you're being considerate of more than just yourself, that you're less likely to strive for it. And I don't know if you guys want to use the raise hand feature or physically. Who has played a sport, a team sport here before? Right? And as a team sport, sorry, my puppy. Sport, we all know, whoo, that dog, that if you don't have a really good goalie or you don't have a really good forward, sorry, I'm a soccer human for those of you who are not understanding my verbiage right now, that you are not going to win the game. Because if your goalie can't keep goals from coming in, it doesn't matter how great your forward is, the other team is going to score more goals than you. And the opposite is true. It doesn't matter how many goals your goalie can keep out. If that forward doesn't put goals in, you're just going to keep being at 0-0, right? Or like the other team might actually score one. And that is what collectivism is. And I try to explain it that way to educators, that it actually, collectivism strives for you to be even more independent because it is so crucial for you to do your part. Because when you fuck up, sorry, I swear a lot, you're not just messing you up, you're impacting your family. For us, family means more than just nuclear family. So nuclear family, extended family, your community. Like, I don't know how to help us understand that. Like, it's not a negative thing. It's a very, very positive thing. And there are other communities who have embraced that and have continued to keep their language. Latinos are the community most likely to lose their language by the second or third generation, versus Asian American communities will keep their language for 4 or 5 generations. Okay, so we don't know our own history. So one of the things that I learned, which is kind of hilarious, because who hasn't heard of El Centro de la Raza, right? Like, hopefully most of us. So how Centro de la Raza came to be was through this thing called the Gang of Four. And it was Bob Santos, Roberto Maestras, who's the one who was linked to the El Centro de la Raza, Bernie Whitebear, who is the Duwamish Center, Daybreak Center, I think it's called. Sorry, my brain. And then Larry Gassett. There were 4 community leaders, and they kept challenging, they kept pushing for rights. And through that advocacy is how we got the lands to build El Centro de la Raza, to build the Daybreak Center in Seattle, right on the water. And so we have had strong leaders in our community for a long time, but nobody teaches us about Roberto Maestras, sorry. Nobody teaches us this history, right? Like, maybe some of us got taught about Cesar Chavez, but I know for a fact I didn't get taught Cesar Chavez in high school. And we're fortunate that today, with media and the internet, we're more likely to be able to find that history. But imagine yourself in the 1990s, where I grew up, going through encyclopedias, right? These encyclopedias did not talk about these things. They didn't talk about Carlos Santa. They didn't talk about oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the person who was a space astronaut, but she's down here and then, what is that history that we're missing to understand ourselves and our possibilities? And that is a huge thing for children. So I'm going to come in here and explain to you kind of like why you're going to be doing a service project in my mind. So I was part of the original committee that was talking about how do you build a Latino leadership? And they're like, well, maybe we have them do this. And maybe I was like, we have them do community service. Because in serving your community, you're not just going to learn how to support them, but you're going to better learn who you are. And hopefully you're going to integrate how necessary it is for us to pull backwards, right? So I'm going to go here for a second. Currently, Latinos have the third lowest graduation rate at 78.7 in Washington state, and the third highest dropout rate at 12.8. Considering the fact that the other demographics are smaller, like in quantity than us, it does mean we probably have more humans that are dropping out of high school and less humans that are graduating high school. And part of me feels, as being in education now for over 10 years, is that we as a system, I will own it, the education system, continue to disengage youth. And we are not shifting fast enough in order to help them understand how brilliant they are and how much future they could have, right? Like, what is that word? Sorry, when I present, words start to leave my brain. Potential they have. And they don't learn this. So my push to you is, if there is a young person in your life, mentor them, spend time with them, or tell them random boring facts that they may not listen every time, but eventually one will go through, to help them understand, to be proud of our culture, to be proud of our community, the way we do things, right? Like, I think I used to get more nervous presenting because I would be embarrassed that I would lose words. And then as I continue to do it, I'm like, no, I'm going to take ownership of that. I speak 2 languages and I can switch in and out of them. That is not something to be embarrassed about, that every once in a while I forget a word. That is something to be proud about. And so, yeah, I'm going to ask my peers, like, what word am I looking for? Do you know? Because I want to show that there is nothing wrong with losing words. There's nothing wrong with struggling to read. I'm a terrible reader. I have to use audiobooks because I do love reading. I just can't do it very quickly. And I still have a doctorate degree. Was it fun? No, it was very hard because there's a lot of reading, but it's possible regardless of how you learn, regardless of who you are. I probably should have pulled this one up sooner, but this is kind of something our team created, because oftentimes, right, we see, I'm not part of those I think somebody was calling it like identity politics. I'm not going to tell you to use Latino. I'm not going to tell you to use Latine or Latinx or Hispanic or Chicano, because that is not my place. You get to decide what your identity is, right? And you get to put that label on it. And sometimes when people push back on Hispanic, I get a little frustrated, because Hispanic comes from the word española, and hispano in Spanish doesn't mean Hispanic. You're taking an Americanized verbiage term and placing it over something that doesn't have that historical context, because that is what Spain used to be called. It used to be called Española, Hispaniola. So for me, I'm like, why do you care if someone identifies as Hispanic? Is it currently hurting you or harming you in any way? No. And then we sometimes also embrace the colonization, embrace the nationality, and we forget that we all have indigenous roots. That while Spanish is a language that combines us and binds us together, and that is a beautiful thing, we all had indigenous languages. I had to do a lot of reflecting on the fact that I'm from a very tiny village in the mountains of north easternish, centerish Peru. There is no way that my first language in my community was Spanish. It was maybe Quechua, but maybe something else. I will never get that back due to colonization. That is lost to me. And I need to be able to understand that and then push back on that as much as possible, and still try to own my indigenous self, because I am indigenous to that region, right? And then people often forget that, like, we have Afro-Latinos. Like in Peru, you have a large population of Japanese and Chinese immigrants that came during building the railroads. And like, they're now part of our community. And we have arroz chaufa, tallarín saltado. These are all foods that are built with an influence of the Asian community and Peruvian ingredients, right? Things found in our region. So it's important for us to understand and hopefully share with others younger and older than us how important it is for us to understand that we are very diverse in nationality, in regions, ideals. And we are a large population in Washington state. Later on, I have that statistic, but this is a map, and it's like the darker the purple, the more Latinos are in that area. And so you'll see here that obviously we have the eastern side of Washington has more Latinos. They have anywhere between 20 to 69%. And here in the region that I'm in, I believe we have like 12%. And then, so those areas are 9.9%. You go further to Spokane, it goes down to 3.1 to 6.3%. So they're regionally, we're all over Washington, but we're also in specific areas, right? Some of the things that the people before me mentioned already, so I won't focus too much on it. We're 13% overall of the population. Mexican Americans are the largest population of immigrants in Washington state, regardless of Latino. And you can see here that the first number is Mexico at 139,000, so 57%. The next highest number is 16,000 at 7%. So it's kind of amazing to see like how much of our immigrant community is from Mexico, considering like how, like I always ask my aunt, how did we end up here? It's so cold, right? So even though we're so high up in north of the US, we still have a large Mexican population. And one of the reasons why I push for us to bring mentorship into the world is because while yes, you can get your ducks in a row in 9th grade, the idea of whether or not you're going to be successful in school starts much younger. Research shows that by 2nd grade, girls will start to weed out careers that they don't feel that they can do based on societal things that they're learning in school and in their community. That means that all of us are doing that, right? Not just girls. That means boys are doing it. It means Latinos are doing it. Other people are doing it based on what society is telling us. And so while we have a huge growth in those attending post-secondary degrees in the past 5 years, you can still see here that we're only at 50% of males and 58% of females that are obtaining a post-secondary degree. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that college is the end all be all, but I will say that statistically in this area, you're more likely to earn, your wage potential goes up significantly with each degree you get. Having a high school diploma, you make more than someone who didn't. Having an AA means you make more than someone who only has a high school diploma, and so on and so on. And that's just important because unfortunately we live in a capitalist society. But also representation in these areas is critical. Like I'm in education, but I'm in an area that's very suburban. So there's not a lot of Latinos there. I think in the last few years, we've increased in the number of administrators that are Latino, but teachers are still very scarce. And while some people might say that it's not a well-paid job, an incoming teacher gets paid $60,000 a year, but they have 3 months off. So if you think about it from an hourly rate, they're getting paid like $60 an hour. I did the math one time. So you have to teach kids that it's not just about the overall salary. There's also like a life balance thing, right? And then there's like you get put into the state, so you get a pension. You get really good medical for a very affordable price. So while you might go into and you're not, and like $72,000 in corporate world means you're usually in a managerial position and you're working 260 days of the year, if not more, and you're working longer hours. So teaching is so critical and such a part of our community because we definitely are a community where we teach others, we teach our siblings, we learn from our elders. It's so innate in us, and any of us could really be a teacher if we went and we, learned how to do it and practiced it. Yet we're so underrepresented in education on the Puget Sound side. I went to a conference and it was amazing to see how many Latino teachers and administrators were on the eastern side of Washington. But sometimes I feel like when you're a smaller group, you need to see that even more so that you can see that possibility. Another thing that I find super interesting, we're in a country that really pushes for history, and Latinos are 17% of active duty service members, which is the second largest, or well, technically the third largest if you count white, and then African American, Black, and then us. But we've participated in every U.S. war since the Revolutionary War. So we've been participating in this country. We've been fighting for our freedom and those in our communities, in our country. And we're also highly decorated. And so when we think about how much they like to take us out of history, but how much we've participated in history, it just goes to show you that it's important for us to do our own research and share those stories. So I don't know how many of you watched John Leguizamo's special. I think it was on ABC, but maybe it was PBS. It was amazing. And it was just a few hours of my day, and I learned so much historical things about Latinos in the United States. And those are the things that we need to show our youth, because we need to help them feel like they belong so that they can push, and so they can push others, because it is hard to hear that we still have hate crimes occurring, right? Like, one of the things we're trying to push in our schools is like, we cannot allow hate speech, but people, you walk around the schools, they will say racial slurs to each other. And that isn't helpful. If that's the only narrative a youth is hearing, they might start to believe it. All right. I don't know how much time I have, but that's all I put on the thing because I didn't want to keep talking at you. So I don't know if we want it, how much time I have left, Leah.
You have about 15 minutes left.
Okay, cool. So can I put them in rooms?
Yes, how many?
Yeah. Maybe 3 per room for 10 minutes so that they can talk with each other about what's something new you learned or what's coming up for you. And I can put that in the chat. Welcome back, everyone. I think you're all slowly coming back in. I'd like to invite you all to either, like, if you feel comfortable, to either share something in the chat that you think is really going to stand out or something that came up for you. And if I could get 1 or 2 volunteers to like actually share out, that would be awesome. So just unmute and share.
That was a really good comment.
Thank you.
I can start with something we talked about in our group is it was really interesting to me that the statistic you said that in 3 generations, the Mexican Americans, they lose their native language, their tongue, Spanish tongue. The Chinese American, they keep it for 5. So that's pretty interesting. I was telling the group is I grew up in my household speaking Spanish when we walked in the door and then English outside the door. And for that, I'm thankful to my parents because I can still communicate with my elders. I know some of my family, my cousins that don't speak Spanish too well, and they get made fun of. And, that's just the harsh reality is, you're Mexican, you should be able to speak Spanish. And sometimes we just don't grow up speaking it. So I think that's important. We should keep our tongue. And like you said, it's a loss that you can't get back.
Yeah.
After Sally. Yeah.
And one of the important things, so I have kids and I'm married to a Dutch American who also he actually lost his language. So his first language was Dutch, but when he went to school, his parents were told that it was interrupting his learning of English. And so his parents stopped talking Dutch. He spoke Spanish pretty well. He spent like a month in Argentina, but we could not create, it's called a language rich environment sufficient enough for him to learn and parent, and for my kiddos to learn Spanish. So my kiddos don't speak Spanish. One of them understands you really well, and one of them is learning to understand you, but like neither of them want to talk it because they get made fun of. But one of the reasons why the Asian American communities have been able to keep their language is, I don't know how many of you've seen, they have like Mandarin Saturday school, Korean Saturday school. And they do this as a community, and they keep it as a community. So it's important for us to understand that in order for all of us to have the same accessibility, we have to either, one, push for our school districts to begin the adoption of dual language programs, which I'm proud to say we have 4 schools that do it. So we started at kindergarten. We have up to 3rd grade, where kids are being taught only in Spanish in kindergarten, and then slowly increasing the amount of English being introduced into the classroom. But think of how long we've been here and how long it took Washington to do that. So as a community, we need to also push. And, you know, if you're a good teacher, like maybe you could teach Saturday schools. That's how me and my cousins kept our language. My mom was a teacher, so she taught us every weekend in summer. Okay, one more share or 2 more shares, and then I'm gonna be on time to let you go.
Our group talks about kind of multiple things. One, Brazeldi has background with like voters and having like the low Latino voter rate, and she does a lot of work with like reaching out, and she realized that she could connect it to what you were talking about, and that a lot of them can't vote because they just don't know how to. They didn't know kind of voting was for them. It's kind of like a separate demographic that does that kind of stuff. Or they're like not, they don't have the proper documentation to vote. Another thing we also kind of acknowledged in what you said is the indigenous history that you spoke of, that a lot of like Chicano or Mexican American or just overall Hispanic history is written after, you know, colonizers came. So a lot of stuff that we can be proud of, especially in indigenous culture, and having like our features even represented, there's no documentation of it. So just kind of taking advantage of what is available and taking pride in that. We also, I know Janera also spoke of a time where she took a Chicano, like a Chicano studies class, and I also took a similar one. And just growing up, I didn't really hear a lot of like Chicano history to be proud of, just mainly from my dad. But I just thought that was just within our community. And just being able to see documentaries like about the Zoot Suit riots or Cesar Chavez was really, it really helped bring me pride, especially when growing up. So I do think that should be highlighted a lot more as well.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you all for listening to me and talking about what you know, Latino history in the US and in Washington specifically. I did put the link to the John Leguizamo documentary on PBS. It's online, and I think it was streaming on something. I can't remember what. So yeah, that's all I have for you. I'll hand it back to your host, and thank you for having me.